Okay, well, thank you for coming this morning. I really want to thank you all for coming out, and I want to thank Paul. We've been talking about this for a little while, and we met a long time ago. But it's interesting how these relationships form in these communities that we're all part of, and connections get made, and things happen from that. In fact, I'm here really because of Damon, meeting him a while ago, and he introduced me to some of you. And it's just been a wonderful gift, because for the longest time, I was just this weird guy at home trying to move objects with my mind, and I didn't really have a supportive community or anything like that. So for me, it's a blessing to be here and to be able to share what I know with you. And so thank you so much. And I really just want to talk about my personal journey and why it can be your personal journey, and how this has an effect on the scientific community. And then Damon will take it even further in terms of research. So I began my consciousness development, which I would call my spiritual path, out of a fear of death. Because as a young child, I had appendicitis and I almost died, and that had me thinking about my mortality. And other things happened as I started growing up, or I got ill or something would happen, and I would be scared again of death. And I was raised a Catholic, but I wasn't satisfied being told what to believe. I'm very stubborn that way. And by the time I was in my mid-20s, I started practicing Buddhism, thinking that meditation practice would give me a way to find my own answers. And all the way into my mid-30s, it had done a lot for me, and the meditation practice was very powerful, and had a lot of benefits, but it still hadn't answered this primary question that I always carried. Am I more than my physical body? What happens when I die? Will I continue? Will some part of me continue? And about 5 years ago, actually starting 6 years ago, I still wasn't satisfied with what I found out, so I started training myself to have out-of-body experiences. And after I had my first one, my fear of death was completely gone, and it was wonderful. And at the time, and I still do, I was teaching meditation. I've been teaching meditation for a long time, and if you've ever been into meditation, I think we can all admit that after a period of time, it gets really boring. Sometimes it seems like nothing is happening, although at a deeper level, certainly something must be happening. But I thought, how can I use the out-of-body experience to inspire my students? And I really couldn't find a good way, because how do you show someone an out-of-body experience objectively? You can't. You'll show them a body laying on a couch. Look, out-of-body experience. Or there I am in bed. Look, that doesn't really work. But I had this newfound confidence in my non-physical nature, and a newfound confidence in my ability to discover new things for myself instead of being told what to believe or being given practices from someone else. Just realize that if you work hard enough and look deeply enough into yourself, you can make amazing discoveries. So I thought, what can I do, aside from the out-of-body experience, what can I do to inspire my meditation students, or just to show people that we really are more than physical bodies, that we are more than we believe we are. And I started finding people online who could move objects with their mind, which I refer to as telekinesis. And a lot of the kids around the world doing this, they call it telekinesis, and I find that in the scientific community we refer more to as psychokinesis. And of course, psychokinesis is more broad-based because, for example, if you're doing spoon bending, you're holding it in your hand, so there's contact there. Whereas in telekinesis, there's the implication of distance. And that's what I do, moving something across a distance. So I found people doing this online, and I thought, I'm going to learn how to do that. And then I'm going to show my meditation students as a way of indicating that the mind really is a lot more powerful than we think it is, that it is trainable, and that some part of us can extend beyond this layer of skin that's wrapped around our body, that we really are incredible beings. So gleaning whatever information I could from people's videos, and also applying everything I've learned through my meditation training of over a decade at that point, I would sit down in front of an object, and just for example, we could talk about a piece of tinfoil balanced on a needle underneath a glass container. I would sit down in front of it, trying to make the tinfoil rotate just using the power of my mind. trying to figure out how to make it work. I'd sit there in front of this little contraption day after day, about 45 minutes to an hour, and nothing would happen. It would just sit there. And every day I came back to try again and again. And then after 2.5 months, I sat down, and eventually it started to turn just a little bit. And then I got excited, and then it stopped. And that's when I started learning some of the subtleties of PK, that relaxation is so important. And as soon as I relaxed and surrendered a little more, it started to move again. And there's something else that happened right before I started moving. In the days before I had my first success, I would lay my head down on my pillow at night to sleep. And as I closed my eyes, this spontaneous image of the object moving on the needle would appear in my mind's eye. I wasn't creating, it was just appearing right there with my eyes closed. Soon after that, when I had my first real success in the physical world, and it showed me that something had to change inside of me before I could see the change outside of me in the physical world. So after that first success, I kept training and trying new things and honing down the technique because I wanted to teach this to other people and inspire other people. And I came up with this formula, which I call T.R.E.E. And it's very basic. It just says time plus relaxation plus intention plus attention equals movement. And I'll go into it in a little more detail as I continue speaking. It really just means that the process of moving an object with the mind requires the passage of time, just like baking a cake. All you need is to mix the perfect ingredients together, preheat the oven, and put the ingredients in the oven for the right amount of time. Bake at 350 for 40 minutes, you pull it out, you get the perfect, delicious cake. And so this process of psychokinesis is the same way, that it takes time and patience. And then relaxation of the body and the mind, which has implications in terms of what's happening to us physiologically. Are our brainwave patterns shifting during that time? Is our blood pressure changing? Is our chemistry changing in some way when we relax for PK? And then the use of intention and attention. These have implications in terms of how we relate to our conscious mind, but also our subconscious mind. Because our ego wants things to happen in a certain way, and our deeper self has its own plans for us. And somehow we need to make these two aspects of ourselves communicate with each other to produce the effect that we're looking for in terms of movement. And I just want to break here, in terms of this T.R.E.E. formula, it applies, I've found, to other aspects of consciousness exploration. For example, with the out-of-body experience, when you're training to leave your body, it requires a passage of time so that you can relax your body and mind, so that you can put in the right intention for yourself, especially with the subconscious mind. Placing your attention not on the physical feedback of the body, but instead placing your attention maybe elsewhere in the environment to direct your energy body away from the physical, and things like that. So the change of how you use your attention, and then equals movement or a shift of your reference point in reality. So that's one way I define the out-of-body experience, that your sense of self is separated from your physical viewpoint to some other location in space. With remote viewing, the same process applies. We need time to relax, to get into that cool-down state. We relax the body and mind. We have the intention to perceive objects, people, locations distant in space and time. And then what we pay attention to matters, that we no longer pay attention to the very coarse objects of mind, like thoughts and ego processes. Instead, we pay attention to the very subtle things that arise. And this is the signal line where we receive data that we're looking for in remote viewing. And then the result is the movement, which here pertains to the movement of the mind, receiving the information. And then the same process is applicable to meditation, of course, the passage of time, relaxation of body and mind, and then your attention and intention applies to the process of mindfulness and concentration equals meditation. So this formula is really universal in terms of exploring parapsychological effects or psi phenomena. But let's go back to the psychokinesis specifically. I found that even though it took me 2.5 months to figure this out, now I can teach it to people in under 2 hours. And I generally teach it in various stages. So when I teach this in class, I start with having people develop a relationship with the object. That's the piece of tinfoil. And you can do this with paper. I've done it with gold and silver and copper and other materials. I've done it with organic materials, like with leaf cuttings. Basically putting the body in close proximity to the object, with the idea that maybe the body's energy field is somehow involved with this, and then I'll fast forward and tell you that it's not, or that that's not the only way that this happens. But so they experiment with just bringing their hands close and far to the object, getting a sense for its movement. And then after some time has passed, we go to stage 2. And this is where we apply the glass container over the object. You see my hands are touching the glass, and here I'm moving a piece of paper, and this is from one of my online courses. And as I'm looking at the object now, I'm applying a special breathing technique to monitor my consciousness level and to help me relax and to unite the activity of my body and my mind. And it's really just a very deep, slow in-breath and out-breath, and holding the breath in and out. And at this stage, it's really important for people to discover that during stages of the breathing cycle, for example, during the long inhale, the object might be rotating counterclockwise. And then when they hold the breath for a moment, the object stops moving. And then they exhale, and then it can reverse direction. It doesn't always work that way, but it works that way often, especially in the beginning. It shows that there's some type of yin-yang relationship happening here, with the breath affecting the movement of consciousness, affecting the movement of the object. Now the obvious question here, which is a very fair question, is it just moving because my hands are warming up the glass, and it's warming up the air inside of the container, causing convection? And that's a fair question. And what's happening here is that it could be the case, and I don't think it is, because of that relationship with the breathing pattern and the movement of the object. But that's why we go to the next level, the next stage. The other thing that could be happening when we're moving the object, if it is convection, we're actually just fooling ourselves into believing that we're doing psychokinesis, which is actually really important. This has been noted, especially with faith healing, where like in the Philippines, where a healer they'll use animals' organs or artificial blood as they're working on someone to make it seem like they're going in the body. I'm not saying that's always the case. Sometimes someone's hand actually goes in the body. But there's a thing about confidence. I think it's been recorded with a lot of mediums, including in Europe, that sometimes they cheat, and sometimes the cheating helps affect the consciousness in the room and people's openness. So even if it is convection when the hands are on the glass, it helps people relax and helps them build their confidence. But at this level, I take people beyond by just having their hands 3 or 4 inches off the edge of the glass, applying the same instructions, breathing a certain way, looking at the object with a very relaxed gaze, because where we look is where energy goes. So where we pay attention is where energy flows. If you're familiar with things like the law of attraction, The Secret, things like that, there's a principle that where you pay attention to in your life is where energy goes, is where the change happens. The same principle applies here, that the eyes are important, being relaxed is important. And then eventually the object moves. And then after that, we go to the next level, after they've built their confidence up. And until now, the hands seem important. A lot of people think maybe there's energy shooting out of the palms of your hands, pushing the object, which may or may not be the case. So we have to go further and see that the hands are really training wheels. And people just put their hands in their lap after a while and repeat the instructions, just paying attention a certain way. And they find that they have now formed a very strong relationship with the object. And PK, I find, is very much about relationship and trust and relaxation, just like a human relationship. And they can go even further and sit across the table and continue applying the instructions, and the object continues responding to them. Usually at this frame, people say, well, have you ever tried just leaving it there and leave the camera running? If you weren't in the room, would it keep moving? And I have. I mean, I've let it move overnight and it sits still. So this just shows that it's not particularly about the energy in the body moving it. It could just be about consciousness affecting the larger reality. And the hands near the object, they were just training wheels. So we can take it even further. And still, in my 2-hour classes, people can take it to this level where they have their hands in their lap, and after a while, when they've developed a relationship even further, they can stand up, look at the object, and the process continues, and then take a step back. And some of them can even leave the room, close the door, keep their attention on their object, and keep it moving. In a lot of cases, it'll still move in rhythm, in connection with their breathing pattern. Okay, so once someone is at that level, they can start all sorts of different experiments for themselves. Like here, I'm experimenting with different metals using gold, silver, and copper foil, because there are a lot of ideas out there about gold being a very special metal. And so here I'm standing about 6 or 8 feet away, and that's a close-up of the metals just responding to me. I'm trying to figure out, does gold work better? Does silver work better? Is there something special about these metals? And I find that the only thing special about these metals is that they all like to mess with me. Sometimes gold works really well, while silver is just sitting there stubbornly. And then I go take a bathroom break and come back and try again, and then silver starts spinning and gold doesn't do a thing. So there are a lot of questions that come out of these types of experiments, very few answers, but I think that what's really important in this kind of research is coming up with really excellent questions. Questions that we can't think of until we get to that level. Here's another experiment that takes things further, and that's, what if we have an object in 3 separate containers? Because we can ask, is it about energy or consciousness going to a very specific place wherever I'm looking? Or is it more of a field effect that's spreading across the table, or that's filling the containers separately? And so my goal is usually kind of get them all to move at the same time. And that's where the ego gets involved. What can I do here? Which gets in the way. So the more I relax and the more I let go, the better flow occurs. And I don't mean the flow of energy from my body to the object, just a sense of flow with reality itself, with relaxing into my deeper nature, into my subconscious nature. And my subconsciousness knows what my conscious nature is trying to accomplish, and they work together with the larger reality system. Now, of course, I'm speaking theoretically here, because how can I prove that? Well, that's what we're trying to do, is gain more information about that process. This is just another variation on the very same experiment. I put 2 toothpicks and balanced them on a little piece of paper to put them on the needle, thinking, can I move something that's not aluminum foil? Can I move something a different shape? And there you see the toothpicks moving again, just balanced on the needle. Now, it took a long time to get that movement. I had to sit there for about 16 minutes before it started responding to me. And what's interesting is when I worked with the toothpicks, usually what gets them moving, and I discovered this accidentally just by trying again, is I remote viewed my way into one of the toothpicks, trying to vision the cellular structure of the wood inside the toothpick. And as soon as I did that, it's as if I entered the toothpick, and that's when the whole setup started rotating. So to bring it back to the relationship to other psi phenomenon, there was one time I had my PK set up on the table, but I wasn't intending to do psychokinesis that day. Instead, I was going to do a practice session in remote viewing. So I had my pad of paper and my pen, and I was trying to view the target image. And then I opened my eyes after a little while, and I noticed that the aluminum foil was spinning like crazy. It's as if I'd opened a door, and it was affecting that. So I think psychokinesis, remote viewing, and all these other things have a common root. So you open one door, and you have access to multiple things. And it's really just a matter of exploration, experimentation, just trying wacky things to see that these connections exist. Okay, so yeah, I'll say just a few more things. The main point about this is there's probably someone at your table or in your section right now who knows how to do this. And when I tell people how to do this, they learn how to do it in under 2 hours, which drives me nuts, right? Because it took me 2.5 months. After I had succeeded at it, I asked my wife if she wanted to try it, and she said, sure. So she sat down in front of the device, and I was all cocky, and I said, well, do you want me to show you how to do this? And she's like, let me just do it. And she sat down, and again, it's covered by glass, and she just did this. Just gently waving her hand, and the thing started moving really well. So, so I had to work so hard at it. For her, it came naturally. But one thing I knew about my wife is that through the years, she's had many lucid dreams and ordinary dreams in which she performs psychokinesis. And if you know about lucid dreaming, it is a direct access to your subconscious mind. So it tells me that she was already open to the phenomena, that she had already practiced in her dream state, so that it happened to her the first time is not a surprise. In fact, a lot of Eastern traditions, there's a notion that if you want to learn how to perform miracles, how to do psi abilities, you learn them in the dream state. And then because you realize that the physical reality is actually not separate or different from the dream state because they're both based in consciousness, then that's how you can learn to perform miracles in waking reality. So my wife's an example of that. She'd already learned how to do it in her dreams, and then doing it in physical reality came easy to her. So that's the gift of technology when it works, is that we can share this information with each other, share the instructions for making these things happen across the world, and you can be your own experimenter. You can learn how to do this in a few hours, and then you're not only a psychic, but you're a psychic researcher. You can start learning from your own experience. Luckily it's the 21st century, because a few hundred years ago, if somebody caught you doing this, you'd be burned at the stake. But here we are, sharing this information openly and freely across the miles, over the distance. And so I think PK, at least this level of PK, is very accessible and can open up a lot of new doors that I don't even know about yet for research into consciousness and parapsychology and even quantum physics. There are a lot of implications that we just don't have enough time to go into, but there are a lot of doors that can be opened when you learn how to do PK yourself, which everyone in this room can do. If you're a human being and you can follow instructions, you can learn how to move objects with your mind. So I think I'll pause here and turn it over to my collaborator, Damon Abraham. And I think we'll have time for questions later on, and we'll have discussion period later on.
Okay. So I was pretty inspired by the work that Sean was doing. I saw him at the PRF, I guess, a year and a half ago or so. And I had previously had a lot of my own experiences with psi-related phenomena, dreaming, body experiences, and also through my experiences with the martial arts, internal aspects of the martial arts. And what really attracted me to this method, though, was that it is kind of easier to contain within an experimental context. It's a little easier to measure. And a lot of times, psi-related phenomena tend to be kind of tricky to pin down, right? It seems like, well, you know, we all probably in this room have had some experiences that we might label as synchronicity or, you know, precognitive or what have you. But then when you start to try to apply a statistical p-value to it, the whole thing falls apart and unravels. And so, you know, I was personally very excited to learn this method to see if I could not only train myself, but also to see, you know, if we could do something that's replicable in a laboratory context. And it's a little bit more demonstratable to my colleagues in the university setting than just telling them about some wild dream I had or something like that. So just briefly to give you kind of an orientation of what I'm going to talk about, just lay out some of the study goals that I had with this little experiment that I ran. I'll talk about the different various phases of the study, and then hopefully if there's time we'll get into some conclusions and possible future directions. So goals. So my study goals. Goals are the building blocks of failure. Oftentimes what we set out to do and what actually ends up happening don't always jive with each other, but it's still a fun process nevertheless. So personal aim was, you know, I wanted to train this in myself to you know, develop this as a skill. There might be some ego motivation behind that as well. But throughout my life, I've had a lot of experience, and I've always been very interested in sharing these things. But to find a method that, you know, was fairly reliable and easy to produce and could act as a demonstration for others. Hopefully, what I liked about this method was that it was something that could be very eye-opening to others about the assumptions we make about how reality works don't necessarily pan out. And it's really important for people to start to get that insight that things may not be as they always appear. Also, I was interested in developing a protocol for other future formal experiments. And in particular, I was interested in simultaneous measure of macro PK, or like the telekinesis method that Sean was doing, and combining that with some research I was already doing with micro PK, which I'll explain in a minute. So one question I had was if we could detect a reliable signature of macro PK other than the visual of the object movement. If there was some kind of signal that was embedded that we could possibly detect. All right? So to get a bird's eye view of the low-hanging fruit, what I did is I basically replicated this method 2 that Sean discussed. I was looking at, you know, macro PKs in terms of effects that are large enough to be observed by the naked eye. It was the same setup that you just saw, so I won't go into too much detail there. And I was applying Sean's training method. So this is just an example to see what the setup was. I don't know if this will play, maybe. Yes. So this is at home in my basement. I had a little HD cam set up there. Cats are very important to the process. They want to be involved in any way they can. So I was able to kind of eventually move my hands off the glass in some cases, and I think at some point even put them on my lap. This is sped up quite a bit, but it gives you an idea of the basic setup. Yeah. Yeah, it helps to kick the table, I noticed. So at the same time, so I had the little HD camera set up and I was recording these sessions. And at the same time, I set up a random number generator in my laptop. So many people here are probably familiar with this, but I'll just kind of briefly touch on it. Random number generator basically acts as a little electronic coin flipper. So at any given second, there's going to be a distribution of ones and zeros. And if the device is operating properly, that should be a relatively equal and predictable distribution of outputs. But when things start to get interesting is when you start to see some non-probable skew in the data where it's either overrepresented in terms of the number of ones or the number of zeros. So imagine if you're flipping a coin, in this case 256 times a second, when you start to get an improbable amount of heads or tails consistently, then we think that maybe something's happening here. So, you know, our expected outcome in 256 flips is relatively balanced between 228 ones and zeros on average, right? And any given second may not be that, but over the course of the session, you might see you'd think that you would see a relatively equal distribution. From there, I took each second of data and I calculated a z-score. So you can imagine that 128 would be like right at balance, you know. But as you start to get more and more in either direction, you start to see further and further away from that predicted average in terms of standard deviations. And to represent that visually, you square the z-scores and you sum up the cumulative deviation over the amount of seconds. And so what that ends up looking like, this is kind of right out of the Global Conscious Project standard graphs. A given typical session, you're going to see kind of like deviations, if this is time in seconds on the axis here. You're going to see fluctuations in the output of the data, but you know, you'll see that there's, on the whole, it's going to kind of stick within a probabilistic distribution of flips. Does that make sense to everyone? Hopefully. And a significant session oftentimes looks like this, where you might see the same kind of random walk, but over the course of the session, the deviations start to get outside of the parabola of what we would expect statistically. Okay? So for each session, you know, I have the object in the container, and I started off with generally a pre-test breathing meditation, and at this time I was recording the object, and I would be in the other room doing some meditation. The recording of the object made sure as a baseline, as Sean mentioned, that the object wasn't just moving spontaneously until I had my own attention applied to it. And these sessions were generally self-timed, so you know, usually between 20 and 40 minutes where I sit there and actually apply attention to the object, depending on my energy level, etc. The device I was using was this T.R.E.E. This device is pretty well tested. It's been used a lot for data encryption. Online casinos and things use these devices to basically generate true random numbers. Importantly, this was a field setup. So what that means is that there's no real-time feedback from the random number generator. My only feedback was the visual of the object moving. There's several practitioners out there, notably Herb Mertz from Cylon Group is one that spent hours and hours and hours and hours intentionally moving the outputs of the random number generator in the same way that Sean is moving the object. But that's not the case here. I was trying to use this as like a passive signal to see if it was picking up on any kind of side effects. Does that make sense? So as I mentioned, I was collecting video simultaneously through a webcam. The video was synced in time through a user interface that I created. And the analysis was following the global consciousness protocols for the most part. I also created a marker channel on my computer so I could just push a key press to say when I thought something significant was happening. And one of the events that I marked was sync text that I got. Anyone ever heard of sync text? Does anyone know what that is? It's not around right now, but some of the alumni from the PEAR lab at Princeton created this app, which I'll explain in just a second, but basically it would send you random text messages when your own little random number generator in Princeton, New Jersey would just deviate. It would determine some critical threshold and decide arbitrarily to send you a text message. And oftentimes those text messages would be highly pertinent and relevant to the situation going on, hence the synchronicity of text. So I'll give an example about how this can work. It's just like a little monthly service that shows up on your phone. On one occasion I had this cat, it's like the beta female. She's always very starved for attention because the alpha female won't let her get. So whenever she can kind of corner you by herself, she's just like all over you. It's one particular case, she's just rubbing in and out of my legs, and I'm totally ignoring her. In fact, I think I had Facebook up, probably looking at pictures of cats. That's Adam Curry's, one of the inventors of the Syntex app. So I'm totally ignoring this cat, and then boom, this text message comes up that says, "Someone who adores you greatly is hidden right before your eyes." This is one example of numerous cases where I found that these messages that were coming through were very, very meaningful and significant to what was happening at the time. But it's not something that you could force to happen or make happen. I couldn't meditate and say, "Sync text now," So it's kind of interesting how these types of phenomena happen. This is, I think, a genuine type of psi phenomenon, but also is not very extensible to traditional statistical measurement, right? But I did create a marker channel in my app, so when things like this happen, I could indicate in time what was happening and when. Okay, so just some baseline quality controls. I ran about 500 hours of simulated data with my random number generator, and this is the distributions. Those are the alpha values of 0.5, 0.1, and 0.001. And basically, these are the statistically significant sessions of that, which is exactly what you'd expect. So within about 500 hours, you'd expect about 5% of those to just deviate random, by chance alone. That was about 25 tests. I got 26 tests, so it's performing, right within expectation. And about 0.6 were above P of 0.01. So it seems to be the device itself at baseline seems to be performing, predictably well. So phase one. In phase one, I did 6 training sessions. This is before I've ever been able to generate any movement with the object. As I said, they were self-terminated between 20 and 40 minutes, generally preceded by meditation, and I was capturing RNG data, but I did not have video, unfortunately, of those first several sessions. So just the results of those, my very first session, the very first time sitting down with the object in the foil in the glass, no physical movement, but I did get some interesting results with my random number generator. And I also got a sync text. And this happened maybe 10 minutes into the session. And the sync text said, "Experience is analog, perception is digital," which I thought was kind of interesting because I'm working with an analog interface and a digital interface. I'm like, that's kind of cute. Right? My second session, not much going on there, at least on the reg. But the third session had a pretty strong deviation as well. But the fourth and fifth, nothing there. So, 2 out of 5 sessions, we can't make a whole lot out of that, but it did give some promise that maybe the reg was picking up on some kind of, psi indicator, if you will, or at least my efforts that I was putting into moving the object. On the 5th session, I did get an interesting sync text as well. The session overall was not significant, but in this period, I decided to take a break because I just was, I've been sitting here hours with this thing at this point, across several sessions, and I was getting frustrated. I haven't gotten any movement as of yet, and I just kind of pushed my indicator to say I'm taking a break, and I sat back in my chair, and I'm just like, I'm done. And the text came up and said, "As long as the mind gives up before the body, we're destined to be slaves in this world." That's kind of funny. On my 6th session, again, the session overall was not significant, but you'll notice there's this kind of interesting bump here that happened towards the beginning. And this was actually my very first movement. So the first time that the device started to wiggle, and I was kind of dumbfounded. I was probably texting Sean, and I think I was looking to see if I was vibrating my desk or something, like what was causing this. And if I were to just kind of isolate that section, you see that it does deviate. You can't make too much of this, but it is kind of interesting if you zero in on that little section. It seems like something was happening. And you notice that there's a pretty marked deviation from the rest of the signal. So it gave me some hope that maybe there was something being measured by the reg that would indicate like psi is happening, if you will. Right? So shortly after that, Garrett hosted Sean at his workshop, or at his lab at Boulder, and we all tried to do this together as a group. And Sean's had, as he mentioned, pretty remarkable success with these workshops, so we decided to do the workshop. We filmed the workshop and also collected random number generator data at the same time. So we had 7 attendees. The whole workshop was about 2.5 hours, including a break. Everyone in the workshop who attended was able to move the object to some degree. We did sync the video with the random number generator, and again, I had the marker to indicate when significant events were happening, or seemingly interesting events were happening. So this is the session as a whole. You know, if you look at it as through the entirety, you know, it has some dips where it goes above the parabola of significance, but it, you know, as a whole, the session was not in terms of random number generator data. But there's a lot happening here, breaks, etc. So we can kind of unpack that and look at some of these key events. So this is the very first, you know, this blue area is when we're just kind of setting up and talking, not a lot going on. Here's where we actually place the glass over the object, and you see kind of a marked increase there. That does end up kind of seeming like something's happening. And it sharply drops off as soon as everyone's getting distracted and laughing, and people seem to be losing their attention on the video. In the middle of that, we got a sync text, and I think the content here, the context was that we were talking about the ego mind and how, you know, we kind of get self-involved with these types of experiments and how we desire certain outcomes, etc. And the text said, "People are stupid, but you are people too." It's kind of an interesting reminder. Again, if we isolate the start of the peak phase where we place the glass until like people start getting distracted, we do see that was a pretty interesting deviation. Then towards the end of the workshop, we did two other important sections here. First is a FaceTime. So everyone's familiar with FaceTime on the phone. We had Daniel Persaccio is here in the back. Actually, he's one of my good friends and martial arts teachers that has been working with these types of things through breathing and meditation for a number of years. And so we had him go out in the hallway with the FaceTime app, and then I just held the phone up. So we just had the video feed to the object while he was moving the object from the hallway with no line of sight to it. And so not only did the object move, but we saw this nice little bump in the data. We then tried to move several objects at once with 3 objects in one container. We tried to move them as a group. Going through that section, it also seemed to dip a little bit or bump a little bit. Interestingly, it was a very key moment on the video where someone just kind of goes, ugh. And right at that moment, the data just dropped off and plummeted, and we were not able to move the object past that point. Okay, so after this workshop, I took this back home and I started doing some actual tests at home with the video synchronized. And I did 15 sessions with the same setup as phase 1. The video and the object in the glass, collecting random generator data. Everything's synchronized. And so my hope was, now that I saw through this workshop that there's this great psi detector signal in the random number generator, that these things should just be synced up perfectly. But overall, you see none of these sessions were really significant, which is kind of funny. But I created a nice little clever user interface. And so basically I could play the video from each of these sections, and I could also display the random number generator data, and I could mark time sinks in the video and see when the object was moving and mark that in the video, and then that would highlight those sections of time in the random number generator data. So you can just isolate those movement periods and then extract all of the times when the object was not moving. That makes sense? And looking at that, only 2 of all of the movements had reached that significance threshold. So basically, in short, we did not see this kind of tight coupling between these 2 phenomena that we had hoped for, or I had hoped for. But nevertheless, I thought it was kind of an interesting experiment. So one thing that does come up a lot with respect to psi phenomenon is decline effects. So you'll hear a lot of, especially with people that are doing the meditation with the random number generators, trying to move the line up and down. You might have some initially very strong success that then seems to kind of taper off. This happens a lot with remote viewers as well. You have these first sessions that are really profound, and you have all this great experience, and then like maybe your accuracy starts to dwindle over time and then pick back up. So I just kind of plotted the session number and the proportion of the entire time that I was sitting there, the object was actually moving. You see that it starts off and it's kind of low, it goes up and then declines again, and then it starts to pick up at the end. There's a lot of other things happening on here though. I was trying to experiment without using my hands, and I was trying to, it wasn't consistently always my hands in the glass, etc. So there's not a lot there to suggest that there was decline effect in terms of the actual object moving. And if anything, my personal experience doing this since, I think it's kind of the opposite. It feels like almost like any other skill that you have some ups and downs and ebbs and flows, but in general, the more you practice with the objects, the better it seems to be. If I, keep away from it for several weeks and come back, I might have a little bit of a, return to a little bit of a learning curve, but then if I, apply some intention and do it for a few more days, it'll pick back up. This is also a representation of how many minutes it took before the session, how many minutes I'd have to sit there before the object actually started to move. In general, it's about 5 minutes. There are some sessions where it took quite a bit longer, but again, I was experimenting without hands, etc. So some conclusions. I definitely think that Sean's got something here with the method. It's highly trainable. It's replicable. It seems like a pretty interesting way to have direct access with these macro phenomena. Out of my 15 sessions, I did not stop until I got that damn thing to move. So I had 100% success rate, at least getting the object to wiggle a little bit. There was some suggestive evidence of a decline, but that likely be more of a practice effects with the macro PK at least. So the question then is, can we detect a reliable signature of macro PK or psi more generally buried within the random data? Definitely doesn't seem likely with the present methods. So then there's this question, is it a signal to noise problem? This often comes up, like perhaps there's just not enough fidelity in that random signal to really pick up and capture the psi effect, that it's there, but it seems like it takes like this critical mass. You see how this is often talked about in terms of the Global Consciousness Project, like you have major world events that coalesce and 9/11 being a key one, Princess Di, and there's all of these devices across the world seem to synchronize and deviate from randomness. And so maybe it just takes like this huge happening before it detects the psi. I'm not convinced that that's the case. I think it might be more of a frame of reference problem. And what I mean by that is it seems that the micro PK effects and the sync texts in particular that are both running on these random systems, they seem to appear and track more with the profundity or the meaningfulness of the experience, not the mundane aspects of the object moving, if that makes sense. It seems like, as with synchronicity or any of these other kind of profound experiences that we tend to incline to think about when we think about psi, it seems to be kind of tracking on a higher order of meaning and relationship than something that we can kind of bottle up with the ego and try to just like apply as a test. Does that make sense? So just on a little tangent about that. When I presented here a few years ago, we had the lunch after, and I got to sit with John J. Kinnaman, and he showed me this symbol. I thought it was just really profound. So it's a Vedic symbol that apparently was very influential, some of the founders of quantum mechanics. But basically, it's kind of like a symbol of relationships. So if we take like one little system, and just say it's an isolated node or an isolated system, its number is 1. But once I add a second isolated system, we really kind of end up starting to get a product of the interaction between those systems, right? That's not easily defined within the context of 1 plus 1, right? So 1 plus 1 is actually kind of more like 3. We add more nodes to that system, and so we end up getting an exponentially increasing number of potential relationships as we add these nodes. So M.S. Farouz talks about meaning fields, and I think that this kind of fits with this analogy. If you think about on the lower order of things, it's really kind of more about the how. Right? I'm sitting at the table, and you're trying to move the object, you're thinking about the mechanics, if it's chi or whatever, but you have this very confined system, right, where it's just you and the object and the relationship between those things until the object starts to turn and move. But some of these other psi phenomena tend to be happening more on a layer of why, right? Like, what does it really mean if the object moves? Beyond a mechanistic how explanation, right? First and foremost, to me, it means that reality doesn't work at all how we think it does, right? So even though it's just a little piece of foil moving on a toothpick or a pin or needle, it, in a very profound way, shows you that all of your fundamental assumptions need to be reconsidered, right? And what I thought was kind of interesting about, especially with how sync-text was working in these sessions, was giving these kind of insights that I couldn't control, I couldn't predict, but yet were either, coaching you to move forward or, advising you not to be an idiot. And I think that that's really kind of profound and interesting. And I think that that's happening, those types of relationships are happening at these higher order levels of meaning, right? And when you think about that, when we think about higher order levels of meaning, we have to consider the interconnections of ourselves with other people, maybe spirit guides, who knows what are the actual mechanisms. I know Jonathan's here, he likes to talk about the people that are big fans of The Secret, like I just intend it and make it happen because I think about it. And that often takes for granted that there's other agents out there with their own wills and intentions, right? And so these higher orders of meaning are interacting with other agents and other intentions and other, maybe greater, deeper purposes than just me sitting there moving the foil. And so I think that's an important thing to consider with respect to the phenomenology in general, and why we have these kind of trickster phenomena. It's hard to take some of these higher order meanings and then bottle them up statistically and make them congruent to our egoistic will, right? So, moving the object is relatively mundane in comparison to the broader meaning fields. It's easier to model the behavior. It either moves or it doesn't, right? There's relatively limited influences, right? So it can be influenced via self-determined factors. If I sit there and I practice and I, intend on it, I can make it happen. Whereas, these deeper meaning fields tend to be more complex and subtle. There's a multitude of influences and possible mechanisms, and they don't seem to be as conforming to the expectations of the ego or attempts to replicate, which is where this idea of the trickster phenomenon has come up with the field. Right? And there may be some degree of mechanism independence, right? So when we look at the object moving, we have a tendency to try to explain it in terms of physical terms, like is it chi from the hands? Is it, we're trying to think about it in terms of a mechanism that we can understand, and our bias is to think about mechanisms in terms of like physical things that we can objectively quantify and measure. Whereas if you start from a level of why, there's a lot of different ways or routes from which a process can occur. And to give you an example, everyone here, who's right-handed, raise your hand. Okay? Who thinks you could write your name with your left hand? Right? But you could also put the pen in your teeth, or you could even use your toes, right? So the why layer is like, well, I need to write my name. The how is really kind of context dependent and can vary quite a bit. But we're so conditioned to look at processes in terms of how and try to reverse engineer the why from the how that we sometimes, I think that leads us astray quite a bit. And another, I think a great tangent that I won't go into too much today is the idea of like, how do you parse meaning from information? And right now, with a very material reductionist mindset, we're looking at information and trying to infer meaning. But perhaps the relationship between meaning and information is kind of like the consciousness-brain relationship, where we tend to think of consciousness as some derivative or product of the brain, as opposed to an expression, like the brain being an expression of consciousness, for example. And I think that the relationship between meaning and information is similar, whereas meaning and information have a tight relationship, but that doesn't mean that meaning is inherently derivative of information. Maybe if I can put this in a little bit more concrete terms, is everyone familiar with the thought experiment or the Chinese room? Okay, so let's say you have a room that's black boxed and you have no access, you just have inputs you can feed into it. So on one end of the room, someone's feeding in Chinese characters, And inside the room is a little guy with a book, and he just translates the Chinese to English. He just follows the instructions in the book, and he outputs English on the other end. Make sense? So you feed in Chinese, and you get perfect English out the back. So you say, well, whoever's in that room must be a perfect Chinese speaker. Okay? So this analogy has been used for artificial intelligence, for example. You think that maybe that person in the room doesn't have to know anything. They just follow the instructions in the book. They don't have to have any interiority of the experience of the language or what's being conveyed. They're just translating symbols. Make sense? So as it applies to our thinking about a lot of problems, and I think with respect to artificial intelligence especially, we think that we just keep throwing information or throwing more data and somehow interiority will emerge out of that. I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I think that it's a very worthwhile practice to kind of fluctuate between these lower orders of meaning and these higher orders of meaning, and that's something that's really kind of interesting that we're allowed to do with our present faculties, is that we can kind of transcend these different levels and consider problems from multiple dimensions. And I think that's extremely, extremely important. But it also makes it really frustrating to try to study a lot of these phenomena because they don't congruent with the lower order of how or procedural operation. They seem to be elusive. We can't bottle it up for some reason. And I think maybe we should stop trying and think about how do we apply a deeper meaning to what it is that we're doing and why are we doing this in the first place. So to return to the idea of why are we sitting in front of a foil object, it's not to move a piece of aluminum foil, right? There's something else, there's a deeper purpose in doing that. And I think it changes our relationship with reality. And that is much more important than being able to move an object at a distance, right? A good example of this, so everyone here is familiar with Bill Bankston, hopefully. So he has some incredible experiments with human mice, and they've done multiple versions of this. Sometimes laying the hands on the mice, the hands on the cage, distance healing, and then more recently he's been working with Dean Radin, and they put him in the Faraday cage, and they try to block any known sources of signal, so to speak, and he's sitting in this room and they're recording multiple, any kind of measurable thing they can, sound frequencies, light frequencies, etc. And they're trying to see, can we capture the signal of the healing? And guess what? All that comes out of this is noise, right? Just noise. There's no discernible signal or patterning or meaningful pattern emerging from the signal that they're getting. Yet, if they take that noise signal and they convert it into an MP3 file, like a sound wave file, they can play it in cancer-affected tissue cultures, and they see some of these same kind of healing effects, just playing basically what amounts to white noise out of the speakers. So what is that? So you're getting some kind of communication of intention without any discernible signal. Right? So it tells us that maybe there's this intentional layer that's just on a higher order of meaning, and that higher order of meaning doesn't necessarily congrue with the mechanisms that we expect to see. And I think that's important to keep in mind. This is a good time to mention, actually, that he is debating coming out here and doing a workshop in August after the SSE meeting. So if you are interested in that, hopefully we can get some information coming out. But it should be pretty fun. It'll be a 2-day workshop. We'll be doing hands-on learning his healing method, and so you too can create sick mice and cure them in your basement or however you want. So I think I already kind of touched about this. Future directions. So I would like to replicate this in a much more controlled setting. I do have some access to the laboratory, so it'd be nice to have a little bit more rigor, not so much variation in the experimental context. Sean and I have been talking about extending this current paradigm to a remote influencing paradigm. So he didn't show a video of it today, but I think lately he's been actually walking down to his parking garage with no line of sight of the object and just recording himself, recording the object at the same time, doing his breathing and getting the thing to move remotely. So some really cool opportunities there, especially when you think about pairing the data streams. Neural signatures of PK, there might be some applications for neural feedback, for example. I'll play that video. should have Sean up here talking about this, but recently he started doing experiments which is recording the EEG signal off of the Muse device. Is everyone familiar with Muse? It's just a little, yeah. So this is kind of exciting because if you think about, if there is maybe it's not the random number generator data, but perhaps there's a detectable signal in brain data that we might be able to find like the signature of, you know, what's predictive of whether the object's going to move or not, and then use that as a training device. So, you know, if you kind of knew if someone's kind of off target, you could give them cues without, you know, just by reading the brain data. So this is like, you know, way off in the future, but I think, you know, they've already mapped the neural signatures of meditation, and the use was specifically created to train meditation, because you get the brain waves and get auditory feedback as if they're reaching a more, you know, what they say is a canonical meditative state or not. Well, if you had the canonical marking of, you know, psi, particularly with, you know, what kinds of brain states are people in when they're moving the object, and you might be able to expedite the learning curve by having that as a feedback instead of just meditation. So I'd like to also look at seeing if there's other patterns in the random data beyond what we typically see with statistics. I've done some tests. I was able to work with Karen Newell and Evan Alexander when they were here for the IANS conference, and we recorded their workshop, and there was no significant deviations in the data overall. But if I took out the key segments, as I did before, when things seemed to be happening, and it wasn't their workshop, it was his keynote address. It kind of made like a highlight reel of the address. So it's hard to say. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I think that has to be really played out. But if you could, like, instead of just like say something meaningful happened, let's look at the data and see what it's doing. If you got to where you had somewhat reliable measure of like something profound is happening, kind of like how syntax does, then you can maybe use this as a signaling device. So like, hey, something might be happening here. So that's kind of an interesting idea. Also the extensions to other fields. So at the last SSE conference, Garrett had introduced the topic of cybotics, which I'm not going to attempt to explain here. But it is kind of interesting when you think about creating meaningful behaviors with devices that are maybe derivative from what we think are random processes. So kind of like what sync text is to a messaging app, think about random number generator powered devices that we interact with and start to create meaningful interactions and get behaviors out of. So this is my son. This is his first time sitting there with the object. So just to show that it is very, very trainable. That's in real time. That's not sped up. So, you know, his first time doing it was far better than anything I've been able to accomplish so far. Of course, the young mind is not so restricted, but I do want to make the point that I think that this is a very trainable exercise, and I think, you know, it's enjoyable, and I think it's more if we get like kids kind of interacting with it, we can start to see some shifts in our predominant ways of thinking early on. Yeah, so I just quickly wanted to say thank you to all the collaborators, and York Dobbins and Roger Nelson are involved with, they were PEAR alumni who kind of developed a lot of the statistics that I used. Of course, Sean, and I didn't get to talk about the research I've done with GW using random number generators, but I do want to mention a big thanks to him, to Shirley as well for hosting all those sessions. All right, I guess we can open up to questions.
Thank you. This is a question for Damon. Would you explain what sync text is and how we get it?
Well, the easier part of the question is how you get it. You can't, unfortunately. They are kind of trying to develop the next version of it, and so they have discontinued the service. So what it is and how it works, it's essentially just a messaging service. When you sign up, they assign you a random number generator that's located in Princeton, New Jersey. It was part of the old PEAR lab. And it just sits on a server, and when it deviates beyond a given threshold, it decides arbitrarily, like, yes, something's happening here, send the person a text. And you have several beds of text you can choose from. The standard is like a fortune cookie set, which was that one I got with the cat. But you can also customize it with your own, and I put a lot of my own messages in there, and oftentimes it would send those back to me when those key moments were happening. They are supposedly coming out with a new version called Guide, but I'm not sure when that will be forthcoming.
So. Good. Okay, well, thanks. I'm curious about your intention as you're moving that. Two thoughts. One is, do you have the intention to move it a direction or just to move it? And then when you have the random number generator, did you distract your attention because you had potentially two sources that you were aiming at?
Yeah, that's a good question. I tried to divorce myself from the reg as much as possible, and it was running in the background. I had no feedback from it. So even though I knew it was running, I wasn't fixating on that. And I also didn't, generally I didn't look at the data until after I'd accumulated all of the data. So I wasn't going back and saying, oh, something happened wrong. As far as the making the object move, it's not so much, and Sean can talk about this maybe better than I can. I'm really following his method, but I try to keep it as non-specific as possible. If you start thinking about direction and stuff, you can kind of work against yourself. And it tends not to go in the direction you try to make it go. And as Sean said, oftentimes it'll reverse direction based on your reading and stuff. And it's really tricky, just finding that delicate balance to where you're engaged with the object enough, but also kind of taking a step back from it. It's kind of a weird thing, and once you figure that little trick out, it seems to move a lot better than when you're really fixating on something very specific.
You had your eyes open for feedback.
Yeah, it did.
Okay, you have been using the random event generator as a measure of what's going on or giving some scientific feedback. How do you know that REG is responding to your activities as opposed to, for instance, dying or 9/11 occurring? There's events all over, there's REGs all over the world that are measuring these worldwide events. How can you be sure that what yours is doing is responding to you and not to the bus driver down the street?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think another way of thinking about that question is to reverse it. How do you know that the Princess Di phenomenon is actually a global consciousness effect and not a Roger Nelson effect, right? And Garrett's done some interesting experiments, I think, with the regs that really kind of show that there may be some profound experimental effects happening, right? So then you could ask, is it my own personal trickster, my own subconscious that's only making these effects appear at certain times and not jiving with the ego, and what the ego wants is like, hey, I want an on-off signal telling me when the object's moving, and that didn't happen. So I think a lot remains to be explored with these devices and really to understand what's actually going on. And I find that I get a lot more purchase in evaluating that when I divorce myself from the expectations that come from a material reductionist explanation of what is the actual mechanism. Instead of thinking like the what and the how, if I start to kind of get back to the level of why, the effects seem to make a little bit more sense, and it's easier for me to find a good working relationship with them, if that makes sense. Right? I think, let's go back to meaning fields for a second and think about it in this terms. I don't play the piano, but I'm just going to use that as an example of a skill. You start off with your chopsticks and everything, all of your attention, your focus is on the gross motor and the very mundane aspects of playing. And as you get better and better and better, your mind starts to get more and more pulled away from the mechanics and more on the expressivity of the piece that you're playing, right? More on the connecting to that meaning of the piece and the emotion and how do you convey the emotion. If you want to mess up someone if you're playing golf and the guy's a better golfer than you, or girl, the best way to screw them up is say, I just have a question, when do you breathe? Do you take a breath in the backswing? Or, right? Because as soon as you put the focus on the mundane again, it's not congruent, right? They're past that. So going back to sync text or random events, the problem, I think, sometimes with trying to capture these with statistics is that we can always go back to the data and try to see this effect of retrocausality too. Who knows what's actually causing the behavior? But if you can kind of black box the behavior so that some random process is happening that we don't have access to, it starts to develop perhaps some kind of will of its own, or at least a a meaningful behavior that we don't know what's driving that behavior other than how we observe the behavior occurring. So think about it in terms of like, maybe some of these ideas with like random systems that are generating behaviors, but we don't have a way of looking at why or how it made those decisions. In the same way, we don't want to look at like what muscles and nerves are firing when I'm playing the piano. I want to be focused on the piece. Make sense? Yeah. I think Jonathan had a question. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that comment too that this type of research and measurement using random number generators, all of that is appealing to the conscious ego mind. It likes taking measurements. This happens at this specific moment, and then it ends that moment. And so it's not state specific because PK is in two states. It's in the conscious mind, it's perceiving and wanting something to happen, and the subconscious mind, which has a lot more to do with the effect occurring. So somehow we could get into state-specific research where we have something measuring what's happening at a subconscious, deeper, hidden level. But it's not about measurement that, it'd have to be something more profound than something that just satisfies the thinking, ordinary mind. For example, there's an anomaly that can occur with PK, where if you work with the same object for a certain amount of time, you might just walk in the room intending to sit down in front of it, and as you cross the threshold, it turns to look at you. Or you might sit there for half an hour working at it, and it doesn't move. You finally give up, and you stand up and walk away, and then it responds. So it's sort of on that level that it's playful. It doesn't respond according to time signatures. It's not measurable in that specific way. It doesn't respond in that way. So we're using something, science right now, or the technology we have right now works at a certain level, that what PK is happens on a very different level, and also on a very ordinary level as well. So.
Displacements.
Oh, with remote viewing?
Yeah. So Sean has been doing some workshops with remote viewing that I've taken, and it's amazing how you get so much displacement. Is everyone familiar with that idea? So you have maybe two images. One's your target, one's kind of a lure image, and you get incredible information of the wrong image, right? So it would fail your statistical test because you're not identifying your target greater than chance, and yet it proves the phenomenology experientially because you were able to observe something remotely that you should have no access to. Right? So it's that kind of that trickster that happens. Yeah, Jonathan.
Hey, a couple of minor suggestions about the physical apparatus, and then one more meaningful suggestion for an alternative experimental setup. This foil spinners have this sail-like structure, which obviously makes them susceptible to tiny perturbations of air currents. It seems like you could easily test the convection possibility by just taking a couple of hot water bottles against the glass cylinder to see if that would set an emotion. Also, alternatively, the fidget spinner craze peaked about 1.5 years ago. Many of these were made with extreme high-quality ceramic ball bearings, perfectly counterbalanced, the tiniest force of emotion, and they keep spinning. But they're more massive objects that wouldn't be so affected by air current. But the more meaningful suggestion, as you pointed out, that the Princeton egg deviations seem to be related to meaningful emotional events. And the etymology of the word emotion is motion, like the motion of the soul. So if I were doing this experiment, I would have between, and we also know that PK drops off with emotional disassociation that happens through mechanical repetition. So if I were doing this experiment, I would have the spinner, between me and the spinner, or there would be a big video screen, the spinner, and then me, and I would have a slideshow. The slides coming up at 1 minute each, and mixed in with a whole bunch of neutral images. I would want a picture of somebody I was in love with who died tragically, somebody I'm currently extremely angry at. The most faces, because that's what we have emotion, strongest emotion toward, and the most emotionally charged images possible, and to see what that would do.
You could also have your reg trigger the images and select them randomly for you.
So yeah, those are wonderful points that you bring up. And just on your most recent point, earlier this week I was in Utah filming a movie about this phenomenon, and there was someone else I was teaching, and we were filming her learning how to do this, and she started talking about how it would move, and she was bringing up feelings of love, and she was discussing love. I started to think about my wife in that moment, and I had a device in front of me, and as soon as I thought about my wife, everything started moving a lot faster in that moment. When I work with students, they all bring up the topic of loving kindness and these feelings. Do they have an effect? And they certainly do. And you know, if you're familiar with heart math, we talk about electromagnetic waves in the brain and the heart and all that stuff. So it's all connected. In terms of the object looking like a sail and being moved by the wind, that's why I wanted to use the toothpicks, because they didn't have that sail-like structure. But there's a better answer, and this is going to piss off a lot of people. That I had the same question: am I really moving the object, or is something else happening? What would happen if I sucked out all the air from the container? Could I move it in a vacuum? Because what they found with Nina Kulagina, the Russian woman in the 1960s and early 70s, she could move objects almost up to a pound in weight, but when they did it in a vacuum, she couldn't move it. Dean Radin has helped me with this, because he introduced me to the notion of Brownian motion, that air molecules in the container move randomly, creating equal pressure in all directions. And his thinking is, the reason I cannot move the object in a vacuum is because what's really happening is I'm focusing on the object, I want the object to move, that somehow my consciousness is communicating with the larger consciousness system, and it's getting those air molecules to start to move in the same direction at the same time to press on the object. And the reason I like to say that in the beginning is because when people start learning how to do that, they're going to start focusing on the air instead of the object. And the instructions have nothing to do with focusing on the air. And I think we find this across a broad spectrum of paranormal abilities, that it's not about learning how it works, it's setting your mind on the goal. And the greater consciousness system puts the parts in place to make it happen for you. Now, that's not to say that if I didn't try harder, that consciousness could find some other way to move it in a vacuum. And maybe it's possible, but that's for the next generation to figure out. But that's a really good point about the whole process.
So, this is great. You've introduced and discussed a number of things that are really intriguing and also highly speculative. And the question is, how do we go from the speculation to really knowing something? For example, with the meaning fields and the fact that this is teleological and we are really concentrating on the goal and the pull of the goal. How can you quantify this meaning? And I know quantification sounds like a dirty word, you know, these are deeper, more meaningful phenomena. But unless we do that, we're just speculating and we may be very wrong. How can we tie this down?
It's a great, excellent point. So I think that it might be more things that happen beyond the context of the isolated experiment. So, you know, let's say you take a remote viewer, novice remote viewer, and you take qualitative measurements of like subjective well-being or something like that over the course of practice. Or, you know, I mean, you take the same thing with meditators, right? Like you say that people say that meditation brings better well-being and changes their life, but that's all subjective and not very measurable. Yet there are ways of measuring, you know, behaviorally. They can even look at like white matter tract connectivity with diffusion tensor imaging of the brain. And so I think we have to get kind of creative as to what is our measure, and if that measure is meaningful or not. I think it's nice, though, at least, that we do have some measures of the more mundane aspects. That, you know, like just the fact that the aluminum foil turns in and of itself is great, fun, and interesting. But you know, to tie that into a deeper meaning field, I think it's hard to think of it beyond the subjective benefit of doing the practice in the first place. Right? Like, we meditate because we feel like it gives us benefit, not because, well, I want to increase my white matter tract in my brain. You know, like, so I think it's a really profound question. I don't know that I'm equipped to answer it right here and now, and I hope that, you know, I'm sure you have some creative ideas on how to get there as well. But
why don't you just correlate with polygraph biometrics, galvanic skin response that measure some kind of emotional disturbance?
yeah, but I think he's talking more like long term, right? Like the deeper meaning field stuff. I mean, that's because we can't produce these phenomenal experiences on demand. You can produce the mundane psi stuff on demand, maybe. But as far as like, I can't say like, I want a synchronicity to happen now with this type of periodicity that I can measure it. Or, but look at like people like Dale Graff and some of those that are teaching people to have psi dreaming. I think as you develop a practice, the phenomenon seem to happen more frequently. Maybe getting a better marriage between higher self and ego self as these two things are working together. So I do think there's purpose in practicing developing it. And I do think there are ways to measure it long term, but we have to get a little bit more creative.
One last question here. You talk sometimes about psi, about the trickster, about something out there that is fooling with you. Could it be that you're tracking the movement from your own brain and slipping into your own mind and moving back and forth between controlling versus feeling and becoming one with something, and that you're tracking more that movement of your consciousness rather than something out there messing with you?
That's just a beautiful comment, it's a beautiful question, because it talks about wholeness. The wholeness of our ego self, with our subconscious self, the larger consciousness system. Am I seeing a deeper part of myself? Am I registering that change on one level and then I think I'm affecting it on another? And something that happens when you practice this a lot is, it's not so much about paying attention to the object out there. It's maybe 50%, maybe, but it's most about paying attention to what's happening inside of oneself. So when it starts to move, I feel different on the inside, physically, mentally, emotionally, and on some other level that I can't say, but when you practice this a lot, it's more about what's happening here than what's happening out there.
So that gum wrapper is your REG.
That's right.
On that note, I think we should have lunch.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and get going.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.